Hello everyone. Welcome to another session of Delphicon 2023. My name is Ray Konopka with Raize Software, and in this session we're going to be discussing user interface design with actions. So let's get started. In this session, I'm going to be talking about a technique and a functionality that's been in Delphi for many years. However, even to this day, it is still a feature that's not often used, and then most importantly, it's sometimes misused. And so my goal here is to really talk about what actions are all about, what behaviors they give our applications, which functionalities that we can benefit from. And this both applies to VCL applications as well as FMX applications. The initial releases of FMX didn't include actions, but it was one of the things that were brought in. And everything that I'm going to be talking about applies to both frameworks. The actions work similarly. Underneath the covers, under the hood, if you will, they're implemented a little bit differently. But for our UI point of view of how we use them, how we set them up, some of the guidelines that I'll be sharing as we go through, they're the same. And so there's some strategies when it comes to using actions, how we want to take advantage of them more effectively. There are certain things in FMX that you can only accomplish by using actions. For example, tab page sliding navigations is done through an action. And so let's get started. We're going to talk about the traditional approach of writing user interfaces, the one that's really quick and easy, and then we're going to take a detailed look of what it means to convert an application that we have that's using traditional controls, but that one relies on actions and actions lists to make it much easier for our UIs to be maintain their state, to become in sync, and be able to be extended much more easily than they would traditional methods. So to start, I want to ground everybody in the same concept of we're going to be talking about this application, which is a QuickBooks exporter. So let me go ahead and switch over to Delphi 11. I'm running the latest version of that, and all the source code for this sample application will be available. I have the download link at the end. But what we can take a look here is we have a pretty straightforward application. Let me go and run it, because it's made up of basic controls that we've all used: combo boxes, list boxes, bunch of buttons. But let me run it to give us a context of what we're talking about. So this is an application that, in theory, it's a mock kind of application to demonstrate what I'm trying to convey here. But we have some number of commands all throughout our interface. We've got some lists, we've got main menus, we even have context menus on each of the lists to do things. But what it does is I'm going to open up a QuickBooks file. We're going to call this my imaginary QuickBooks data file. And QuickBooks files have a bunch of lists and things that you can export. So I'm driving this through an ini file just so that we have some data to work with. But the thing that we'll note is that my open button is always accessible, because I can always open up a new company file. But none of my list buttons are active yet because I have no data to operate on. Once I go and pick a list, let's say vendors, then I get a number of fields that are available, and based on the selection or non-selection, I have certain commands that are enabled. And this applies both to, in the context menus, I can't add anything because I don't have anything selected. If I select something, then I now get the add button that's enabled, and I can go ahead and click to add that over. And so this allows me to pick a bunch of things. I can multi-select, I can add them all over. Notice that the only thing that's now enabled is the clear button, because I have context, I have items in this list, so it makes sense I could clear them. I can also export the data for these fields because I have items. If I go and pick one, now I can do more things. I can delete that particular one. I can reorder the list. Notice how the state changes when I move it up and down. These are all important pieces that I need to ensure that my user interface remains intact. If I have multiple places to get to things, like if I right click, Well, the move up and move down should work. Likewise, when I'm at the bottom, the move down uh, command is no longer enabled. Well, the context menu also needs to show that. So when we go back to the slides, we'll come back into the code, we'll look to see how all of these things are accomplished. And so let me go ahead and we've tried all this. We can clear that all out. Everything gets cleared. I can unselect, select. Once they're selected, they can all be brought in. But this gives us an idea of how we can make these things work. There's command menus up here. So there's file export. That's tied to the export button on the form. So let's take a look at how this structure of this code looks. So let's take a look at the code behind it. There isn't a ton that's in here. It's not a very complicated file. It's just managing states. But the key things that we'll note right off the bat in our form create, and this is very common in applications that have any kind of sophisticated UI with multiple commands that you need to keep track of, is you will typically have some sort of update status method. And this is what gets called in order to make sure that all the various commands are enabled appropriately. So it's important that it gets called anytime the state of your application can change. Well, it makes sense that when I start up, I'm going to go ahead and call update status. And what we can see is our update status is right here. And what this is showing me is it's very control driven. So every control element that I need, I'm going to be checking something to see if I need to enable it or not. So in this case, if I have items in the fields, I'm going to go ahead and enable it. I have menus that do all kinds of different things, pop-up menus, main menus. I also have command buttons. And so you have to make sure they're all included, that they all get set. So if there's something that's selected, let's make sure that's enabled, and then associate the button to match the add button, the add menu. Likewise, the delete, the clears, the move up and downs, they're a little bit more sophisticated to determine whether you're at the top of the list or at the bottom. So all these calculations go through pretty straightforward. Where it then gets interesting is then when we look at, well, where do we need to call update status in our code? Well, whenever something that our update status method is looking at changes, which can be a lot, the larger and larger your application becomes. And so every time any of the items in either list, the fields or the exported fields, whenever an item in those are clicked, we need to call update status so that the buttons and the menus all update appropriately. Once we do the open and the export, we'll see that. We're not too worried. But then we start looking at the implementation of each of these commands. So when we go to add an item, which could be multiple selected items from the fields list over to the export fields list, well, we need to rip through the selected items for each one, move it over into the exported fields. And of course, because now we have content, remember our exported fields would enable the export button and the clear button as long as we had an item in there. So we need to make sure we call update status there. Likewise, whenever we invoke any of these other commands, selecting all of the items in the fields list, well, that enables the add button. It enables the other buttons and menu items that are there, so we need to make sure we call it. Likewise with the unselect, move up. So all of these commands that I'm, by convention or convenience, I've tied to the menu that it's making these. You can see these are menu buttons that are here, menu commands that I've enabled. And then what we will see is that, like on the buttons, the button handlers are actually signed to the menu click event. So that's very common. We can have multiple controls all sharing the same event handler as long as their signatures look correctly. So wrapping up the rest of the code, not a whole lot more in there of just manipulating items between the two list boxes and making sure the buttons and menus are enabled appropriately. Opening the company file is just opening up an ini file, reading some data, parsing it up, and updating the combo box to make that change. So nothing real complicated, but it's really this management of the commands that we're interested in. So let's take a look back at our slides to continue talking about what actions give us. So just to review what we've talked about in our exporter here is that all of the commands are implemented in event handlers, typical Delphi fashion, nothing odd about that, but except that you have to make sure you assign them appropriately and to make sure they're invoked. The commands share that. That's what I just emphasized, so that we have shared event handlers. Command status is through that magical, all-powerful update status method that's in there. And then one of the key things that we emphasize, you probably picked up on, is that a lot of the enabling code that's inside of that becomes duplicated, because I'm having to make sure I'm enabling each of the different controls. It might be implementing the same thing, checking the same thing. It's often as the larger and larger update status becomes, you have more and more duplicate code that can creep into there. And then the big issue is that update status must be called at various times. And where a lot of UI deficiencies come from is when you miss an important point at calling a method like update status, because any one of those state changes, those command handlers, if you don't call update status appropriately, you will not have your interface be in sync with the data that it's presenting, and that's a big challenge. So all of these are things that actions help us address. And there's two main base components when it comes to actions that we want to leverage. There's the action list, which makes it sound, it manages a list of action components. And the key piece for an action list is it gives us design time access to those actions. And that's what we're going to use in order to build up the actions inside of our application. We'll set up properties for each of the actions inside of it. It looks a lot like a collection. We'll see, if you're familiar with collection properties, you'll see some similarities there. The action itself, its sole purpose is to implement a command on a target, and it's invoked by the client controls. And you may have seen this, and hopefully you have. Hopefully you've played around with actions, but I want to kind of dig a little bit deeper. But all of the client controls, the things that you typically interact with, like buttons, menus, those will have action properties so that you can connect your client control with the action. And that's our last piece there, is that they're connected. And once this connection is made, we get a lot of benefits from it. So really the big chunk, what I'm going to do now is we're going to convert this QB exporter application like it is right now in one that uses actions. And along the way, we'll discuss some of the details. So let's switch back over to here, and let's get started with what we need to do. So I'm going to go back to the main form part here, and you can see I've got the image lists and the two menus, some dialogues, and lots of buttons and things like that. What I first want to do is I want to drop an action list onto my form. So you go over to the component palette, start typing in action, and I'm going to drop an action list right onto my form here. I'll just put it anywhere where I have access to it. And one of the things that you want to remember is, if you have image lists that you're using in it could be your buttons, it could be in your menu items, you want to make sure you assign the image list to the action list before you start adding in other actions. It makes it much easier to make sure that the image indexes come across appropriately. So that's the first thing I'm going to, because my context menus had images on each of those, I'm going to assign the image list, the small version here, to my image list. So I'm just going to go and drop that down. So now my images are accessible from any of the actions that are inside of the image list. Really what that means is that the image index that I can get will reference the image's property that the action list is connected to. So next up is I want to create the actions, and we do that by double clicking on the action list, and we bring up the action list editor, and it's kind of a glorified collection editor. But what we do is there's a couple different commands. We can do a new action. There's a drop down that says to new standard action. I'll describe those a little bit later. But for now, we're just going to be creating new actions. And once I create one, there's some properties that we have over in the object inspector here. And so we're going to set a number of these things up. One of the things we'll start with the name, and I typically prefix all my actions with ACT. And once I make the change, I can add this. I can make the caption add. I'm going to put a category under available fields. The caption is not necessary, but once you put a caption on it, you'll see the categories. The categories will be listed on the left, which is a nice way to group up your various actions. And the image index that's on the ad, I want to be a 0. So we're going to bring that over to there, and then I'm going to create another action. This one's going to be ACT select all. It's already in the available fields because it remembers the last category that you were on, which is fine. I want that to be just select all, and I can give it a space there. And we're going to change the image index to 5. Which we can see that has a nice little image in there. Let's add another one. We're going to call this one ACT unselect all. Also in available fields, we'll change this to unselect all. And this will be image index number 6. So not working anything fancy there. I'm going to click on no category, create a new action. This one is going to be ACT delete. I'm going to put the category in here to be export fields. We'll make sure the caption says delete. I'm going to give the image index here a 1. Gives it a nice little X. And I'm also going to add in this one a shortcut. So I'm going to say this is Control plus delete. So now I've associated a shortcut with this action, which will, if I press that, it will cause it to be invoked, which is quite cool. So I've got a few more fields to add. So this next one will be ACT clear. And the image index on that one is 2. Category is export. Change that to there. Another new one, we'll put this one ACT move up. Image index on that is 3. Good, it's my up arrow. Still export fields, we'll move up. We can change the property there. Got a few more to go. So ACT move down. And this will be 4. Then I'm going to create another action, ACT open. This one will have a shortcut of Control O. And no image index. We'll give it the category of file with a regular open. We got 2 more to go. Goes quick. ACT export. No shortcut, no image index, so we're just going to change the caption. And then finally, our last command that we have is ACT exit. And we'll certainly list the Alt F4 shortcut for that and update our caption. So at this point, we have our whole set of actions. We can look at all of them by clicking on the All Actions category, and they're all listed in here, or we can filter it down by which category we're interested in. At this point, we've just defined the various commands that we want to use in our application. We haven't done anything yet to update their status, whether that command is enabled or not, and we haven't done anything that implements the functionality. So those are the two pieces that we need to do shortly. But to start, the first thing we want to do is we're going to assign the client controls in our application to the actions that we've defined. And so one way to start that, we'll look at each of the buttons. So we'll start with the add button, and we know that there's an action property, so we need to go and find that. We're going to assign this to the action of ACT add. And you may have noticed that the arrow, the chevron that was after the add caption of the button has disappeared. That's because we've assigned it to an action, the various properties of the action are pushed into the client control. And if I were to change the actions caption to reflect it, then that will show. And I'll do that eventually. So let me go ahead and change the rest of these. So the select all needs to change to select all. The unselect all's action gets assigned. We do the same thing for the move up. And move up and move down. And we'll note that all these commands will become enabled as I'm assigning them, because it doesn't know anything different at this point because we haven't done any extra work. So even though they're initially were disabled, we've assigned an action. The action hasn't been disabled or anything special, so it's all there. So we need to put the export that's assigned there. What else do we have? Well, we've got the main menu. So the main menu has the open command. Well, menu items also have that. So we're going to assign it to the same action. Same thing for the export. The export's going to get its assignment, and even the exit. And so we'll put the exit there. And notice how the shortcuts still show up there. I did not create an action for the about. We certainly could have. I'll leave that as an exercise for all of you. But I have pop-up menus, so let's go into each of these. So this one, a little hard with the gray text, but that's the add to export list. Again, we'll have to see, can we make this special, because after we assign the add, it gets rid of that customization. Fortunately, we can handle that. So this is the select all, and this context menu is the unselect all, so they're there. And then we need to go and do the actions for the menu items. So move up, move down. Let's go after ACT delete and ACT clear. Okay, so we've now assigned all of our client. Nope, I missed one. We got our button here, our open button. Open button gets set to the action open. So now that we have all of these controls set, we can, one of the things we'll see is the on-click event handler is gone. So we need to figure out, how does that work? Well, because when you assign an action to a client control and you do the user interaction of that control, click the button, select the menu item, the event handler for the action will get fired. We haven't created that yet, but we're going to be doing that shortly. But first, let's take a look at what we need to do to update the statuses of all of our controls or actions. And so the way we do that, I'm going to close that down for the moment, but we're going to select the action list and go to the events page, and you'll notice that there's a few events that we can select and write handlers for. The one we're most often going to use is the on update. I'll have more to say about the others in a little bit. So let me go ahead and write an on update event handler for this action list. And I'm going to grab this and bring this up by our update status method, because it basically is functioning the same idea. So with that said, I'm actually going to take all the code from our old update status and move it into our action list update event handler. And I'm going to remove all the buttons, because I don't need to worry about all the the secondary calls, because they're all set to the menu. So I'm going to get rid of all of the button enabled calls in here. So I don't need any of this. And then I'm going to change the prefixes for all the menu prefixes to ACTs, and it's in the selected text. And so I've changed and I've named all my actions to mimic, and so I knew this would work. But this is the code that, so instead of assigning a particular client control, I'm going to assign the enabled property of the action. And then any client controls that are connected to that action will have the same property value reflected on it. The final thing that I need to do here is, because I am handling all of the action states in this piece, in this code here, I'm going to set this parameter that comes in, handled of true, I'm going to set that to be true, because I don't need any extra processing to go further. And we'll describe that shortly, of what does that extra processing do and mean. So because I've replaced the update status method with the event handler, I can now go through and remove all of the update status calls. So that's what I'm going to do next. So I'm going to go through and I'm going to do this quickly. So update status, I'm going to pull out the call. We don't need it in the form create anymore. And we don't need it in anytime the controls are clicked. Can get rid of that. If you guys know, once I hit save, these empty event handlers are going to go away, which is nice. So I'm going to get rid of each of these update status calls. And I think, do we have a couple more? Of course we have a couple more. We have update status calls all over our application. And so I need to find all of them. Couple more here. And okay, so no more update status. So we just deleted a lot of stuff. And what's really cool is that the update status event handler will get called at various times when the application detects some state change or something's going on. It happens for us automatically. And so that's really important. So the next piece that we need to take care of is writing these event handlers, because right now we disconnected the actions from the client controls, the event handlers for them. So no one is calling this menu delete click event, but I need to create an action event handlers. So we do that by going back to our action list editor, and for each one of these actions, and I can do it on this page, but I want to, I can double click or I can go to the on execute event for that. I'm just going to go ahead and double click these, and we're going to put a bunch in place and then move a bunch of code around. And I will try to do that as quickly as possible. I may end up fast forwarding some of the video just for sake of time if it starts running short. But now, once I have these event handlers in place, I just need to move the appropriate code into those areas. And so in order to, so I don't get these things deleted, all these action event handlers I'm going to keep around so I can do some little code cleanup. View of the code. So each of the action event handlers now have the same code that was in the menu event handlers. So pretty straightforward. There's nothing special there. We just moved it from one to the other. And now, since we have some of these empty event handlers, I can go ahead and save, and those will get removed. The open company file, none of that changes. That wasn't tied to an action. Changing on the data set wasn't tied to any action. The closing of the company file was just closing the corresponding ini file. So we've moved everything off, and we are a lot less code. And remember, there's no extra update status methods anywhere in here. So now that we've made the change, let's go and try and run it. So let's go ahead and compile this, run it. Great, it's up and running. We have all of our buttons are disabled. We didn't call it at the startup. It's just because none of the criteria in the onUpdate event handler has been met, so there's no commands to invoke. So now I can go and do my open of the file. Now the opens worked, so that command was enabled. I can go and select my company file again, and I can pick a list. We'll do employees this time. Click on a num, and then notice how everything's in there. The add is there. I can pick multiples. I can select all. Notice when I unselect all, I can't add anymore. I can set these over, add them, highlight something. Now these commands are enabled. Delete it. Those commands are no longer enabled. There's nothing in the code that is actually managing these states other than that event handler. We're not having to call it anytime we do something. And likewise, if I move this up and down, all of the states are managed, including the context menus, because they are tied to the actions as well. So as I move these around, then I can't update that. I can remove it. So everything remains in sync and connected, and that's really powerful. So a couple little comments, and I think I've emphasized these enough already, but just to recap, our new version with the actions behaves identically to the first one. We have fewer lines of code. It's easier to maintain. If we have to add new client controls, or we wanted to add more menu items in there, we can simply assign a new property, a new action to it, especially if it's engaged in there. You can also do changing command properties will cascade through all of the code. So let's take a look at some of the other benefits when we look at actions. So going back to our application, one of the things, if we wanted to change the caption, instead of saying add only, we wanted to modify that, we can go to the available fields, go to that action, go to its properties, and if we say, add to list, then the command that's tied to it automatically gets that. The pop-up menu that is tied to that action automatically gets that, which is quite cool. That we can make those changes very quickly. If you wanted to change an image index for the buttons and the menu items, you can change it just at the action. It's really powerful. I had mentioned before, how can we override the caption on a particular control? Pardon me, maybe we want the context menu to say add, but we want the context menu to be more descriptive than the button itself. So let's say if we change the button or the action back to just simply add, and we now go to the component or the menu and double click on that. If I now go to the caption of this control and say add to export list and override it, one of the things we'll see is that it becomes bold, which we would expect because we've overridden it, but it will show up in here. And what's interesting is if we look at the form as text and we look at the menu add, we will see that the action gets assigned first. And this is actually important because when this gets read in from the component, the form, the stream of the components, the action gets set first. So the current property that's in the add action, which is just add, gets set into the caption of the menu. But the next line, when it reads it in, is overriding the caption of the menu to be the caption that was stored locally. So this allows us to do this customization. Now you may be thinking, well, what happens if I have a button I want to tie to an action, but I don't want it to have the caption show, like I want it to blank out the caption? Well, the problem with that is that empty captions aren't stored in the DFM file. So if you do that, it won't save it. The minute you load it, it will come back and revert back to the actions property. Well, the way you get around that is that in your code, in your form create of your form, you can override the caption to whatever you want after it's loaded and associated the action with it. So you get a ton of flexibility in order to do things like that. Some other fun things that you can do are tied to, let's see here, we can do on the delete action. Let me bring this up. And so I've got the delete, and if we wanted to have the on hint, so I'm going to create an on hint handler for this. And my intent here is that we actually, show what we're going to delete when we hint over it. So it's just an extra little guide there. But the action gives us that ability as well. So what I'm going to do is two things. One, I'm going to bring in some code that I've already had copied over here. And we're going to put that into the delete hint method. So what this is doing is I'm going to set the hint string for my delete to be delete the currently selected item in the export list. And then if I can show it, meaning I have items in the list, it's not, there's something selected. And then the final piece to make this work is on the delete button, I do need to make sure that it does show hints in the UI. So, and it does. So I'm all set for that. Let me go ahead and run this one. Okay, so let me reopen the company file, bring that back. We'll pick some customers, we'll select a few, pick one, and now when we highlight it over, the on hint is getting called, it's pulling in the item that was from there, so we get some added benefit from the on hint event. So pretty cool stuff that we can do to leverage actions in our code. So one of the things I wanted to spend a few minutes talking about are some of the behind the scenes aspects of actions, and specifically, how did this magic of all of the states of the actions get maintained and were accurately reflective of what was going on in the UI? How does that happen? What makes that work? I also want to talk about what happens when actions are invoked. So because of this, that's why we want to have a better understanding, because there are certain things that you can do to actually hurt the use of actions. And so we're going to cover these in the next few slides. So first up is when are actions updated? So the key thing is the application object that all Delphi applications have generates the onUpdate events while it's idle. So in the VCL, that's when the update will pause if there is no activity, which is interesting. It's a little bit more responsive for the message loop that happens on the Windows VCL side. It could be a little bit more selective in when it goes and updates things, because if there is no activity, there's probably no state change. FMX is different. The engine that drives it is a little bit different even when you run it on Windows. So the update process continues even if you don't have any mouse interactions. So the interesting thing is that for each action list that you have, and that's important because you actually can have multiple action lists, but for each action list that you have, the action list on update event is called first, and it takes an action parameter and the handled parameter. And if you notice that, if the action list does not handle, or it doesn't set the handled parameter to true, then the onUpdate event of the individual action is called. So there's some implications for this. So the key thing is well, what does that mean? How often is onUpdate called? Well, onUpdate's called once for each client control that's connected to any action in the list. So if I have an action list with 2 actions in it, 3 client controls, button 1, menu 1 are connected to action 1, and speed button 1 is connected to action 2, the onUpdate event will actually get called 3 times. Part of this is to make sure that everything gets updated appropriately, because if an update of one causes cascades for another, it needs to kind of keep that in check. But it's just loops through a lot. So we've assigned each of these. It gets called 3 times. The client controls tied to the actions in the action list. So the action 1 will get passed into the onUpdate call twice, is what that means. Now, there are some implications for this. So the first is a performance tip. So if you have a set of actions that do not need to be enabled or disabled, then it is highly recommended, well, I highly recommend, putting those actions into a separate action list that does not have an onUpdate handler. The benefit of that is that any of the client controls that are connected to those actions won't actually add in extra calls into onUpdate for each of those client controls. So this is can be a substantial saving, especially if you have lots of commands that don't need to be enabled or disabled. An example for this app would be the open event. Now, this application doesn't have that many actions, realistically, so it's not that huge of an impact. But you can imagine that you have, a couple hundred actions, and half of them or a third of them don't require to be enabled, disabled. Then moving them to a separate action list does make a lot of sense. Second performance tip. This probably should be obvious to most of you out there, and because this onUpdate event handler gets called so frequently, you do not want to include code that takes a long time to execute. And so this might require you to rethink how you obtain or cache the state that is going on in your application. You don't want to be calling a database query to get the right value for the state change. Instead you would call it at one point, cache it until you knew that the data was different, that you would need to pull it down again and then store that off. But you want that to be extremely performant and very lightweight. Shouldn't be taking time to execute. So another interesting aspect of actions is to consider what happens when an action is invoked. And this gives us a deeper insight into how all of these things are connected, why we have onExecute event handlers at each action level and the action list, why there's onUpdate event handlers. This is a path through the system that helps us explain some of that. So we can consider we have a client control, and when we assign an action to it and we click that button, whatever invokes it, that causes the action's execute method to fire. So it's a virtual method that's inside of the action class, so that method gets called. So control gets sent over to the action. The action then calls the execute action method of the action list which owns it. So now control shifts over to the action list. Then the action list will check to see, do I have an onExecute event handler for the action list? And if I do, then go ahead and execute or do the code that's in that onExecute. And then it returns control back to the action. So in theory, you could put your execution code in the onExecute of the event handler. I don't recommend that, because you would then have to check the action parameter that comes into the action list, execute action method, to figure out which code you want it to do. So you end up having a very long method where you have a bunch of if statements in there to determine which action you're wanting to do. And that just makes the code a lot more cumbersome, and you don't really need to do it. So I have never have onExecutes on my action list. So if I don't, there's nothing that's called. Control goes immediately back to the action. The next step is that, interestingly enough, the action will call the application's execute action method. So the application itself can have an on action execute method or event handler. Again, same principle. This is really only valuable if you were wanting to intercept the actions that were being called and possibly log it or do some sort of statistics on it. That might be an interesting place to hook into it, because you could do it at the application level and every action would funnel through there. Again, I would not put the actual code in each of those in order to do that, but that is available. Control goes back to the action. Then finally, the action's own on execute event fires, like we did in the sample application. That completes. Once that returns, once that event handler comes back, then a component message is actually sent from the action, it's called CM action execute, to the application object. Why do you think that is? Well, that is important in order to ensure that the application, which is what's responsible for calling the update status, the on update event handler, to fire. So this says, hey, some action has been invoked in my application. We need to make sure we have the status updated, because typically an action is going to change the state of our application. And so by seeing this and organizing it, it really makes it powerful for us to know where we can take advantage and optimize the performance in our app. So some execution guidelines really quickly. Don't use the on execute event handler at the action list level. You certainly can, but you have to test the action parameter to do that. Create separate on execute events for each action, like we did in the sample. The event will only be generated when the action needs to be performed, which is nice. On state change events, these are interesting. There's two other events at the action list level. They're odd, because the on change event is generated when a category of an action changes, but categories are only used at design time, so it's really not valuable. It's generated when the images property changes as well, which can happen at runtime, but I'm not sure what you would end up doing with that, but it's there should you need it. The on state change is interesting when the state property changes. This was added back when the action manager was added for action manager action bars, but it's only available in the VCL, and they're not used very often in what that functionality was. So you tend to avoid these two events, but if you were curious what they do, there's a quick definition for you. Already talked about the on hint event. It would do specifically what it does is you get the two parameters. Can you show the hint? If you can, what is the hint you want to show? That's the hint string. So you have a lot of flexibility to leverage that. We already did the on hint action there. A couple final notes with actions and images. Make sure you assign those image properties, the images lists, to the action so that it will find them. You definitely want to make use of controls that support an image list, because the index is what gets passed from the action to the client control. If you have an old glyph-based control, meaning that it uses a bitmap for the image, when you assign an action to that client control, the glyph, the bitmap image, gets pushed into the glyph component. That can be tricky, because if you change the image list, the glyph doesn't get updated. The glyph is just a one-time push down into the control. So if you do update the image list that the action list is tied to, you need to reset the action property so that it re-pushes the image that corresponds with that action onto the glyph property. And the same is true for the caption, like I described earlier. So there's also some custom action, standard actions that are available. These allow you to basically reuse some built-in code and functionality. So there's edit commands, file commands, and so forth. There's a number that are built into FMX. They're predefined sets of actions, and they're valuable in certain cases, but they also have limitations that you have to watch out for. And we have one example, like the custom edit actions are really nice. They seem nice, but there's some limitations in how they work, because it requires that it will only work on a T custom edit descendant. So even though a combo box with edit capabilities supports the clipboard, it won't support the standard action. And it's depending on the type of action you use, it's not obvious which ones are affecting which targets. So they're there. Sometimes they're useful. In FMX, they're a little bit more useful because they're a little bit more richer for accessing certain things on the mobile devices that you're using. So that's cool. Tab animations is another example of that. So just real quickly, let me bring up the my edit example. Let me close this down. Navigate. Okay, QV exporter, edit actions. We'll open up this. So in here, in this example, I've got the edit categories, and there's edit, cut, copy, and paste. These are standard actions. When you drop this down and you pull up a standard action, you get a list of standard properties. And I picked the ones from edit, cut, copy, and paste. And so we have a bunch of controls here. We've got combo box, memos, and so forth. And these are tied to the actions. These are speed buttons, and these are buttons. And so if I go ahead and run this, and all I've done is I've tied those client controls to those actions. And when something is selected, the controls enable themselves, and it works quite fine. So if I were to select sample and cut that, it's cut it. Great. I can bring it over to here and I can paste it. Oh, can't paste it that way. I can paste it this way. Why didn't that work? Well, it didn't work because these are button controls that take the focus away. And the way the standard actions work, or most of them, is it relies on what the active control is to determine whether that action applies to that control. So when I clicked on paste, the first thing the paste control does as a button component takes the focus to the button. Well, the button doesn't have clipboard support. So instead of actually pasting it, it actually disables the paste command because it's no longer on an edit box. The same, unfortunately, is true if I select something here and then click over here. The combo box, even though technically does support clipboard operations, since it's not a descendant of T custom edit, it doesn't support that either. So this is one where it's kind of neat. It's got some potential when you start looking at some things that you could do with it. Unfortunately, they've never been taken far enough along to really leverage that, except for the newer ones that have been added in for the mobile devices, like accessing the camera roll or the scanner and other things like that. All right, basically just wrapping up real quick with the actions, action lists, reduce code and maintenance associated with your command implementation and status. Use the on update for your command enablement, set that handle to true so it stops that cascading flow through the system. The action list can handle all of it, which is really powerful because a lot of your status code is used in multiple places. Like multiple actions will be enabled or disabled based on a certain criteria. In our example, items inside of the list. Use separate action lists for performance. If you don't need to update, put them on a separate list, and then handle individual on execute event handlers for each action that you have. And with that, you can really take your user interfaces quite far by using actions and action lists. Thank you for tuning in for this session. Stay tuned for more Delphicon 2023 sessions, and I will be available for some live Q&A. Thank you very much.
What a fantastic session. Every time Ray is on, he really always blows me away with his how good he is. And the good news is Ray's with us here live right now for the Q&A. There you go.
Hey,
Our producer has made you go live. Hi, Ray. How's it going?
I'm good. How are you?
I'm okay. I did put up a little caption earlier on just to say we're having a few issues with the live chat. So it's always the way. There's always gremlins with technology. We get our bit right, but it's everything else that doesn't work. Great session. Really enjoyed that.
Thank
You
you.
covered so many things. We're waiting to see if we can get the questions back in the chat window, but I've actually made a few notes as we were going along. One thing that you showed that I thought was very interesting was when you went to the form text view and you showed that the object first it did that action and then it did the caption. I thought that was quite an important point because I think one of the things that people get a bit confused about with actions is exactly when things will kick in. Do you want to talk a little bit more about that? Because it's also, by the way, how many times do you say the word action?
Yeah, it's really interesting because for a couple reasons. I always like showing that because one, it's a little bit kind of under the cover, under the hood, if you will. Once you kind of understand how things work, it makes things behavior you see in the IDE a little bit easier to understand. Like when you assign an action, and you like to a button, and the button had a custom property on it which is showing up as bold,
Mm,
and you assign an action and all of a sudden the caption property is no longer bold. It's like the IDE is smart enough to know that, oh, it hasn't overridden that. Well, all of that is being done by when you assign the action property, it will populate the other client controls from that action. But if you were to override it, then it will hold it. And the tricky part that I like emphasizing is because this I get this question a bit is, hey, I have a button that has a caption and a glyph, but I don't want the caption to be there. And the button control I'm using doesn't have a show caption property to manage that. How can I get rid of the text? Because what happens is they'll see the glyph and they'll see like an A or the start of the caption because the button's not big enough. So that's where you have to kind of know that, like, oh, I can override it. But if you want to blank it out, then you kind of fight with the streaming code because it'll reset it back.
yeah,
And so,
it's tripped me up a few times. I have to
oh,
say
for
over the
sure.
years.
And that actually is, it's kind of, it's interesting from a UI point of view. We want to make changes to the control. But a great question that came up in the chat window while the session was going on was, like, okay, the action event handler gets fired. Well, can I get to the client control that invoked the action? And the answer is, as well, sort of. There's a client's protected property that's inside the action that if you know how to wrap it, you could get to it, but you don't really want to do that. That kind of defeats the purpose of the actions. Because if I'm going to go after the individual control that did it, what am I going to do with that control? Am I going to enable it or disable it? Well, I've got the action property to do it that will cascade to any other client controls that are associated with the action. Am I going to check it, like put it in a down state or check a menu item? Well, that's what the checked property of the action does. So while technically you could get to that underlying control, I have never needed to do that in any of the UIs that I've driven with actions. So I would kind of warn about going down that road. But it's a great question because it's one that kind of comes up. It's like, hey, how detailed can I get? So hopefully that answers that question on there.
And I think it's about abstraction as well. I think people who are trying to do something with the individual control are probably not thinking about separation of the UI
Well,
element from the action
what
itself,
I
which is
really,
really
and
why it's called
I
action.
probably should have emphasized this more in my talk. What I really like about why I call this session UI design with actions is, over the years, I did like most Delphi developers would do is, you lay out some controls of what you think it's going to be. You start double clicking on stuff and you create the event handlers in code. Well, then as it morphs, as the UI changes, And it's like, ooh, I don't really want to use a button in this case anymore. I want to use a menu item, or a context menu. I don't have the room for this. And I'm changing my UI, but now I'm modifying my code substantially in order to accommodate that, because the event handler isn't there anymore. And I don't like having my buttons necessarily pointing to menu event handlers or vice versa, or sharing them. Yes, you can, but it gets a little unwieldy. And I find that by creating an action, I can set those up and they're just my commands. I'll drive everything off of that. Then I can have the freedom to pick and choose my UI to match how I want to invoke those actions. And it works
Yeah.
really well.
And I think actually one thing that people may not appreciate about actions is it adds a little bit of extra power, because if you think about Microsoft Word or actually any of the Microsoft Office products, you get these little quick action menu in the top left hand side of the UI, or customize the toolbar or something like that. That's
Yep,
done with a kind of action mechanism. And
indeed.
once you get a little bit of code that iterates through the various actions, you can actually say, okay, well, I'll provide these actions in a user interface where I can say, I will customize my toolbar, or I'll customize
Yep,
some kind of quick actions menu, or whatever mechanism you're using in UI. And you can say, on my little hamburger menu or my toolbar, I will have these, whatever actions you choose. And it gives
indeed.
that flexibility to the end user, which is what it's all about, of course, is making the app user interface an experience that works for them. Because if in a word processor you may only ever type text and you don't care about smart art or something like that, and who wants it presented and taking up space on a very short toolbar? So actions can help people enable that in their own interface.
So, yeah,
Okay.
it's
Yeah.
really powerful to be able to do that.
Yeah, it's usually a sign of I work with a lot of different contractors, and some of them are very good, shall we say, and some of them a little less experienced. That's a polite way of putting it about their skill set. And usually, the people that are using actions and understand actions, you realise that they've taken on the value of what the actions actually do. Not absolutely essential. I just want to make it clear to people watching: you don't have to use them. It's not That's not how the whole program has to work. But if you start looking at how am I going to make my user interface divorced from the actual business logic and all the activities that might happen when I click on a button or click on a menu, and instead abstract that behavior out, that's what actions can do for you. And I think you cover that very, very well. Every time I see your presentations, I'm always extremely jealous at how cool and laid back you look and how very comfortable you are presenting. You're an excellent presenter. And that's obviously why you're a popular guy. You've been doing it for a while, to be fair.
Have been doing it for a while. That is
Not your
very
first
true. But
rodeo, is it? Yes.
like so many people who are joining this, we're passionate about the product, and the more and more we learn about what's there, and even this is a fundamental course, and I like bringing this out every so often, even though it's been around for many versions of Delphi. It's one of those things that people still it's a little mysterious. When you look at online demos, it's not like the first thing people do, but it's one of those skill sets that once you understand, because like some of the questions that have come up that Martha's passed along were, like, why not just create event handlers, and why should I worry about actions? And it's one
Mm,
of flexibility. And
mm,
again, initially, if you look at it from the sense of, well, it's just easy for me to click on a button and then write it in the code there, it's fine if it's
yeah.
small and it's simple. But the more you do things, the more you add other client controls, you want to do something additional, you now have to keep all of those things in sync. And I can't tell you how many times, personally, I've run into UI inconsistencies because
Mm,
I enabled a button because of the state was one thing, but I had forgotten to enable the menu item. And so
yeah.
somebody clicks on it and it's, well, okay, that's not the entry point. Actions allow a way to eliminate some of the tediousness of ensuring that your UI is in a consistent state.
Yeah.
I also like it in the sense of it's a common way to manage commands. One of the cool things, and I didn't demonstrate it in here, and it's kind of lost a little favor over time, but the action manager and the action toolbar and things are still exist, and the action menus inside of Brad Studio and Delphi in particular. And so you could basically use the actions to drive your menus and toolbars kind of automatically. And that was leveraged to bring the ribbon interface that was used in a couple places. But the cool thing is you don't need to. You can use any UI that you want in order to leverage the benefits of that. There was
Yeah.
another question regarding the images. I made a couple notes throughout the session of, if you're going to have images, it's important that you set them up ahead of time, and so that things cascade. And part of the real reason for that is they'll work with glyph prep. Like if you use an old speed button that doesn't have an image index, now the new ones do, it supports both, but there was a time with it didn't. And some controls just want a bitmap image property, and you can assign that to the action. It'll make a copy and bring that over. But
Yeah.
really, you want to leverage things that have image indexes. And so a couple examples, like, well, if I want to support light and dark styles, and I have different image lists for each of those, yeah, you're going to have different image lists for those. Only one will be connected to your action list at a time, and that will make the association. But the key thing is the image index is the key piece that is coming across to the control. So if you remember,
Mhm.
like your menu control, the main menu or the pop-up menu is tied to an image list. The action list is tied to the same image list. What is being moved across is the image index. So if you needed to change from light to dark, you want to make sure the image list indexes are the same. And then you
Yeah.
just switch the control to use the other image in the image list. And that will allow you to switch between the two styles should you need.
And it's important as well because if you have a dark theme and all your buttons are black and white and they're all around the wrong way, that's when people start saying, "Oh, it doesn't
Yep.
look right, my theme." Okay, well, we have actually got to the end of the time, so we made it, and nothing blew up
Excellent.
apart from the chat, which is just one of those things. I understand Patrick Prematin is actually answering questions on YouTube, and there is a possibility we may have to restart the YouTube stream because something broke because technology. Why would it work all
Indeed.
the time? Great session, Ray. Once again, it's always good to be on a session with you and see what you've got to say. There will be replays of this. We get asked this all the time, but all of the sessions today are recorded and will be replayed, and we'll have links as well. So it's all good. Okay, thanks a lot, Ray.
All
I
right.
just
Take care.
gonna check and see what we're gonna do next because we may have to restart some streams. But thanks a lot, Ray.
Thanks, everyone.